The Alberta government recently released a geothermal strategy, and it's not so much a strategy as they're going to go out and talk to Albertans and come back with a strategy, but nevertheless, that's the intent, that's the direction they're going. And the official opposition now has released its geothermal strategy, and we're going to be talking to Kathleen Ganley, who's the NDP energy critic. So welcome to the interview, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on.
Well, look, give me an overview of your party's geothermal strategy.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to note about it is that it's part of an overall strategy. So we're sort of rolling out a strategy for economic diversification in the province. We think there is a lot of opportunity in not just geothermal, but in hydrogen. When we were in government, we saw a lot of moves made on renewables, and I think a lot of people were surprised by how competitive those things were. So I think the first thing to note is it's part of an overall strategy. Why we see sort of an opportunity for geothermal is because it capitalizes on a lot of the skills we have already in the province. It's sort of a jobs right now strategy, and it potentially helps us with the liability problem that we have currently in terms of orphan wells. So there's a lot of reasons to sort of think that this might be a really good opportunity for Alberta and to start exploring it, preferably as quickly as possible.
Now, could you give us a little bit of the meat of the strategy and maybe how it might differ from the Alberta government's approach?
Yeah, so the Alberta government has actually taken a not bad, let's call it that, first step forward. So one of the first things that had to happen was regulation that allowed people to sort of understand who owned the energy and that sort of thing moving forward. There are a few things we would do differently, but moving forward with having some regulation there is, I think itself, really important. So it is a good move. I think the concern is, so some of the concerns about what they're doing moving forward is that we don't know sort of what incentives are going to come with it. And I think it's important to have those incentives in place, sort of getting off the ground. It's not clear at all sort of how it's going to pair with incentives coming out of the federal government. So that's potentially problematic. It also has problems in the sense of, so what they've said is that the ownership of the heat will vest in those who own the minerals, which in most cases in Alberta is the Crown. The difficulty is that there are leases for most of those minerals. And so geothermal companies themselves are sort of stuck in an awkward position of having to negotiate and not being able to access the resource. So I think what our strategy has involved in it is an intent to sort of incentivize that development and to work with those companies to ensure that they can actually access the resource, because right now the government plan leaves a lot of issues.
Gotcha. Okay, so there's some regulatory and legal issues to sort out, and you'll be, I no doubt, contributing to the discussion around that. But what about the difference between geothermal electricity and geothermal heat? Because my understanding from the Canadian Geothermal Association is that in Alberta, it's more likely to be mostly heat, but not very much electricity.
So I've heard this from a number of individuals. Obviously, my background isn't specifically in that area. We have heard that the generation of energy is possible. I think a lot of the exploration hasn't been fully done yet, but it isn't the high heat geothermal that we have in Alberta. It's sort of the lower heat. And so that can be used for heat. There are some who think it can be used for electricity, but I think the idea here is to set up a system that provides incentives for companies to go out and develop themselves and sort of put those incentives in the market in the right place that we kind of see what develops. So I think the intention is to be a little bit technology neutral in that way, if that makes sense. But yes, I have heard the concern that we're mostly dealing with heat here, but it's still an extractable resource that I think is absolutely worth moving forward to and worth putting incentives in to develop.
So if I understand this correctly, the difference between your plan and the government's plan will be around some of the ownership of the, clearing up that issue of who actually owns the heat. So the structure is clear for the geothermal developers, and as well as making clear what the incentives are, so you send the right market signals to the geothermal developers. And you're arguing that the Alberta government's isn't quite as good, or is flawed in some way?
Well, we haven't really seen those incentives coming forward, so we don't know a lot about what the government package will be. We have seen a reluctance on their part to sort of invest, to invest in diversification initiatives of any sort, let alone green energy. So yeah, I do think that we need to see, like, it's very well and good that they've rolled out a legal framework, but absent those incentives, I don't think we're going to see a lot of forward momentum.
Gotcha. Kathleen, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.